Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. As Annette said, this is titled Keep Time on Your Side, and this is an organized approach to stay on track from contract to close. I'm sure all of you have at one time or another been involved in a transaction where nothing fell into place like it should, and the transaction seemed to be running you instead of you running the transaction. There's circumstances many times that are out of our control, but there are also many parts of the transaction that are within our control if we take a preemptive approach. And over several years of trying to stay on track, I have developed some tools that help me. And I hope to share those with you, and I hope that you will be better at what you do because of this. Okay, we're going to go over our learning objectives. There we go. Okay, our learning objectives are to understand how to manage a transaction, to be proactive in handling deadlines, and to use checklists and timelines to stay on track. Once you have a system in place, there'll be much less left to chance, and the goal of every transaction for me is to reach the closing on time with a satisfied buyer and seller, and I'm sure that's the same goal you have with every transaction, and to make it go as smoothly as possible. Before we go through our checklists and timelines, it's real important that everybody understand where the time-sensitive paragraphs are in the 1 to 4 family residential contract and the addenda that go along with the contract. So we're going to start by identifying these crucial areas. And it may be helpful at this time for you to follow along with a copy of the contract. Hopefully all of you have that with you. It was sent out with your webinar, and then Annette just mentioned that you might want to get that out. So let's go to, I'm sorry, I'm behind a slide. Let me get you where we're supposed to be. Here we go. Okay, let's go to paragraph 4 of the contract, financing. Now the financing paragraph has several time-sensitive sections in it. First off, if the property is financed, then the time from financing is addressed in one of 3 places, either in the third-party financing addendum, the loan assumption addendum, or the seller financing addendum. And if there's no financing involved, then the buyer cannot terminate the contract based on financing conditions. Now, when the third-party financing addendum is being used, the buyer must indicate whether the contract is subject to the buyer being approved for financing. Now we'll move to paragraph 5. This is our earnest money contract. There's 2 different important time frames in here. First, the earnest money must be delivered to the title company and receipted upon execution. This isn't 2 days later, this is upon execution. So if you execute the contract today, for example, you need to try to get that earnest money to the title company later today or by tomorrow. If you're unable to do that, you can use a courier or whatever it may take, but you do need to get that money to them as soon as possible. Now second, there may be additional earnest money that is to be delivered within a certain number of days after the execution date. You need to note that these are calendar days and not business days. So for example, if you're having additional earnest money delivered 10 days after, and that 10th day falls on a Saturday, you need to have that earnest money to the title company by Friday. If you wait until Monday, then it's late. Now we're going to go to paragraph 6. This is title policy and survey. This is a huge paragraph with lots of different parts, but we're just going to hit on the pieces of this that have to do with time-sensitive data. And I think that this is one of the paragraphs that's most overlooked by most realtors when they're explaining the contract to their client. So let's go through these things. First, title policy, the commitment for title insurance is to be delivered to the title company within 20 days after they receive a copy of the contract. Again, this is not after the execution date, but after they receive a copy of the contract. So again, let's say that you execute your contract on a Friday afternoon, but you don't get it to the title company until Monday morning. They have 20 days from Monday, not from Friday when it was executed. And then if they're unable to get that commitment to them within 20 days, it automatically extends up to 15 days or closing date, whichever comes first. The next portion of this, again, we have lots of issues with this. C, the survey. Now, if the seller has an existing survey and they agree to furnish it to the buyer, they must have the survey and the notarized T-47 affidavit back to the buyer and the title company within the designated number of days. And if they fail to do so, then the seller is obligated to purchase a new survey for the buyer, no later than 3 days before closing. Many people don't understand this, so if you're going on a listing appointment, you want to ask that seller if they have a survey. If they do have an existing survey, go ahead and get them to fill out the T47, get it notarized, and have that in hand so you're ready whenever you do get an offer on the property. If they don't have one, then when you get the offer on the property, take that out. Say you're not going to provide that existing survey, because we don't want the seller to have to purchase a survey because you did not pay attention to the time frame. And then the rest of this section C has to do with the number of days either the buyer or the seller has to purchase a survey if that's what they're going to do. Let's move on to D, the objections. Now, the number of days a buyer has to object to the commitment, the exception documents, the survey, if it's not filled in, then they have all the way until closing. Now, this could be a problem. A seller does not want a buyer to be able to back out right before closing because somebody forgot to fill in the number of days that they have to object to the survey or the title documents. So make sure that if you're the buyer's agent, fill that in when you present the offer. If you're the seller's agent and you get that and it doesn't have a date in there, be sure you put something in there like 2 or 3 days. Now, once the seller makes the objections, they have 15 days from the time they object to cure. The seller has 15 days to cure the objections, and if they can't get them cured, then the buyer can terminate. We're still on paragraph 6. Let's do the last part of that, is title notices. This is another important one. If the property is located in a statutory tax district, the seller must deliver all the notices pertaining to that to the buyer prior to execution of the contract. So again, when you go on a listing appointment for a property that's located in a statutory tax district, make sure that you check with that client and see that they have all of these documents in place. You'll need to have those before you go under contract. Now we're going to move to paragraph 7, the property condition paragraph. Letter A, access, inspections, and utilities. The seller has to allow the buyer access to the property at reasonable times. We all know this. But something that came into the contract this year is that you must have the utilities on for the duration of the contract. So that's new, and we need to make sure that all of our sellers understand that the utilities need to stay on for the duration of the contract. If they're actually living in the property, that's usually not an issue. But on a vacant property, they may have the utilities turned off. So you need to tell them when you go on your listing appointment, when we go under contract, you need to get the utilities turned on. Another problem that this actually happened to me recently is there was a tenant in the property. So the seller had the property, the tenant was in there, the tenant was going to be moving out within 2 weeks after we got the property under contract. Well, the tenant turned the utilities off. We had inspections scheduled and re-inspections scheduled, and there were no utilities on for us to do that because the tenant turned them off and the owner did not turn them back on. So if you have that situation, make sure you let the owner know that they have to get those utilities on immediately when the tenant moves out, and they need to stay on through closing. If you go to section B of paragraph 7, this talks about the seller's disclosure notice. Typically, we're given that notice, we put it out on the MLS system, and people have access to it prior to submitting the offer. But if for some reason they do not, the buyer's agent is going to put in the number of days that the selling agent, the listing agent, has to get that seller's disclosure notice to them. Whatever that amount of days is, you need to make sure that you do get the notice to them. And if the buyer doesn't receive the notice, they can terminate the contract anytime prior to closing, and they'll get their earnest money back. Now, if the seller delivers the notice, the buyer can terminate the contract for any reason within 7 days after they receive the notice. Let's move on down to F of that same paragraph, paragraph 7. This is the completion of repairs and treatments. All repairs and treatments need to be completed prior to closing unless they're otherwise agreed in writing. And if the seller fails to complete any agreed repairs or treatments prior to closing, the buyer can exercise the remedies under paragraph 15, or they can extend the closing up to 15 days if necessary for the seller to complete those repairs. And again, what if those utilities got turned off and they completed the repairs and the seller or the buyer couldn't come back and check them. That's another reason that we need to make sure everything is in order. Okay, our next paragraph, paragraph 9, closing. We know this is like our finish line. This is the date that we're all looking for from contract to closing. And our closing is to occur on or before the date in paragraph 9. Now, it can be extended up to 7 days to cure any objections that are brought up from paragraph 6D, and that's our title and survey objections. Look at letter B4 under closing. This is an important one that I think people may not pay enough attention to. When we close, there needs to be enough funds to cover any liens on the property. So when you, again, as a listing agent, when you go on that listing appointment, you may want to go ahead and do a net sheet, to make sure that there are going to be enough funds to cover any liens that are that are on the property. If they're not, if the seller's going to come up short, then they have two options. Either they need to bring proceeds with them to closing, they need to bring funds with them to cover the shortages, or it's going to be a short sale. Now, if it's going to be a short sale, you need to know that in advance so you can get started on that short sale paperwork and all that. So that's very important for you to make sure that your seller does understand that there can't be any liens on the property and the proceeds must cover any liens at the time of closing. And if you'll look under B, still paragraph 9, letter B, number 5, if there's a tenant in the property, all the paperwork, including the lease, condition form, deposit, all those have to be delivered to the buyer, and the buyer signs and acknowledges receipt of the security deposit, and then that's returned to the tenant. So after the closing, the tenant, their deposit is now with the new buyer. Okay, let's move on to paragraph 10, which is possession. Possession is going to be either at closing and funding, or it's going to be according to a temporary residential lease. The lease is going to dictate when the buyer and the seller are to take and relinquish possession of the property. If you move down to paragraph 11, special provisions, we only want to put factual statements and business details in here. And the one thing that I see most in this paragraph that has to do with time is the time to respond to either the offer or the counter offer. So you want to pay attention to that closely. Paragraph 12 or paragraph 14, if you move down to that has to do with casualty loss, and that's if any part of the property is damaged or destroyed. I think we put the wrong paragraph on there actually as we're checking the slide here. That is paragraph 14. Let's double check that, make sure we've got the right one on here. Give me just a second. Yes, it is 14, and we do have an error on the slide, so it is paragraph 14, casualty loss. Okay, if any part of the property is damaged or destroyed by fire or other casualty after the effective date of the contract, the buyer has 3 different options. Now, when we talk about casualty loss, some of the more common things are maybe a hailstorm where the roof gets messed up, glass is broken, there could be, if there's skylights are busted out, there could be water damage, there could be flooding. There's many things that could occur, and of course a fire is another one. So the 3 options are the buyer can either terminate and their earnest money is going to be refunded to them. This is the first option. Second, they could extend the time for performance up to 15 days and the closing date would be extended. So they're given the 15 days for the seller to take care of the casualty loss. And then the last option would be that they could take the property in its damaged condition, and then the assignment of insurance proceeds would go to the seller, or the buyer after closing. And the seller would need to give them credit at closing for the deductible on their insurance policy. Okay, I think we got confused there on the slides. I apologize for that. We're on paragraph 15, which is default. If the buyer or seller fails to comply with the contract, they're going to be in default. And there's various things they can do. You can enforce specific performance, terminate the contract, or extend the time for performance. Okay, next we have our paragraph 18, and this is labeled escrow, and there's a couple of things under here that we're going to want to cover. First, demand. If there's a termination of the contract, the buyer, seller, title company, they're going to have to agree on the release of earnest money, and then there may be an objection. The first party is going to demand the release of earnest money to themselves, and the other party may object, or they may agree. Under damages, they do have to respond within 7 days of receipt of the request, or they could be liable. Then briefly, I want you to look at paragraph 21 for notices. This needs to be filled in. This doesn't have anything to do with time, but it's very important that this is filled in, because the title company and everybody has to have a way to get in touch with the buyer or seller. If we don't have a way to get in touch with them in notices, then it's going to be very difficult to take care of what needs to be taken care of in the contract. So make sure you do fill this notices in, and many agents they'll have their the email address or the address of the buyer or seller, and then they'll also CC themselves and their email address so they can keep track of what's going on. Okay, paragraph 22, this is called Agreement of Parties. And there's actually 14 addenda listed underneath this, and we're going to go through each of those in a few minutes and talk about the time-sensitive portions of that. And then there's one that's called Other Addenda, and we'll go through that as well. Paragraph 23, this is about our termination option. And in order for the buyer to have an option period, they have to strictly comply to the guidelines in paragraph 23. The option fee must be delivered and receipted by the seller or their representative within 2 days after the effective date of the contract. Now, this is important. You don't just drop it off at the title company. You don't stick it in the mail and mail it. It actually needs to be delivered to the seller or the seller's representative, and in many cases you can take it by the listing agent's office, and there's somebody at the front desk that can receipt it for you. But that does need to be done within 2 days. And I want to stop for a second and talk about how we count in the contract. For example, if today is the day we execute the contract, this is the 1st of November. Day 1 would be the 2nd of November. It's the first full 24-hour day after the execution day. Or lots of people like to think of it as execution day is day 0 and the next day is day 1. So if we execute a contract today, the option money needs to be delivered and receipted no later than the 3rd of November. And if you don't have an option period, you can still do inspections, you can still do everything you would normally do, you can ask for repairs, but you just don't have an option period. Okay, let's look at paragraph 14. It's labeled consultant attorney, but the important part that's under this,
24?
I'm sorry, paragraph 24, consultant attorney. The effective date of the contract is included in paragraph 24. This is the beginning. This is the beginning of the contract. So paragraph 24's effective date is the beginning of one end of the book ends, and the other end is the closing date, and everything else happens in between. So let's make sure that the effective date is filled in, and that occurs when all parties have agreed to the terms of the contract. If you're the listing agent and you're the last one to receive it back, and the date was not filled in yet, make sure you fill that in. And then immediately upon execution, you should send a copy to the other agent and to the title company. And if you're the buyer's agent, you definitely need to get that to the lender as well so they can start working on what they need to work on. Okay, now we have quite a few time-sensitive addenda, and if you'll refer to page 8 of your 1-4 family residential contract, you have a list of all those addenda that may be attached. Okay, we'll start with the third-party financing addendum. The most important part here is it talks about the numbers of days to get approval for financing. This is filled in for the buyer, and if the buyer gives written notice that they can't get credit approval within the specified time, then the contract terminates and they get their earnest money back. But if they don't give notice within the specified time, then they're no longer subject to credit approval. As a buyer's agent, you want to make sure that they do have full credit approval and that you put enough days in here for them to get that. Next, we have the seller financing addendum. We don't see a lot of this, but the dates that you need to look for in here is the number of days they have to provide documents, what happens if they fail to provide documents, and if they have unacceptable credit, failure to provide documents and unacceptable credit would lead to termination of the contract. The next one we have is the addendum for property subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association. I think this is one that many people get out of the contract because they don't pay attention to what they put in there. You have the delivery of the subdivision information. The buyer and the seller agree on a time that the subdivision information is going to be delivered, and in my opinion, the seller should always, when you go for the listing appointment, you should have that seller contact the HOA at the time of the listing and find out how long it normally takes to get the information. Do they go through condo cert? Do they have a different avenue to go through? Are they prepared to pay up front, give their credit card information to the title company when they go under contract, or would they rather order it themselves? There's all these things you need to find out. So when you get that offer in and they're saying that they want the subdivision information back in 7 days, and you know you can't get it in less than 10, you need to change that and counter back with a day time frame that you can get it back in. If the buyer doesn't receive the information, they can terminate the contract at any time prior to closing, and their earnest money is going to be refunded to them. If the seller does deliver the information, the buyer can terminate the contract for any reason within 7 days after they receive it if they have objections, and their earnest money will be refunded to them as well. So this is a very important part of the contract, and you really need to pay close attention to it. And there may be, there could be material changes, false information. These things would also, if these were not provided to the buyer, then that gives them an option to terminate as well. Okay, let's look at the next thing. It's going to be the buyer's temporary residential lease. We don't see a lot of these either. Usually the seller is not willing to let the buyer move into the property prior to closing. But if they were, it's for 90 days or less, and that seller needs to check with their insurance carrier to make sure that that's not a problem if they have a tenant in there. It commences according to paragraph 3, and then the lease itself terminates upon closing and funding because that buyer then owns the property. If the contract fails to close, then the lease terminates when the contract terminates. And that could be interesting, trying to get the buyer out if it didn't close, but again, that's probably why we don't use these a lot. The next one we do use quite frequently, and this is the seller's temporary residential lease. Again, this is for 90 days or less, and you need to check with the insurance carrier and the lender. There are some lenders that want their buyer to move into that property sooner than 90 days. They want them in 30 days or 60 days. So you need to make sure that the lender and the insurance carrier are good with the terms of the residential lease. It commences at closing and funding, and then it terminates on whatever date is specified in paragraph 3. One thing to note is the buyer becomes the landlord as soon as it closes and funds, so they do get a key at closing. The next one we have is the loan assumption addendum. Now, we probably won't see many of these in anytime soon since we have such low interest rates, but sometime in the future we may see these when the interest rates tend to start to rise. There's a number of days that they have to provide the documents to the lender, and if they fail to provide the documents or if they have unacceptable credit, then the contract automatically terminates. Okay, the next one is going to be the addendum for sale of other property by the buyer. The contract in this situation is going to be contingent upon the buyer receiving funds from the sale of another property, and those funds must be received by the contingency date or the contract terminates. If the earnest and then the earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. Now, if the seller accepts another offer, this is where some people get confused. If the seller accepts another offer, the buyers must be notified and given a specific time to waive the contingency, and that's already in this addendum. If they do not waive the contingency, then the contract automatically terminates and the earnest money is refunded to the buyer. But if the buyer does waive the contingency, they have to notify the seller in writing, and usually there's additional earnest money that needs to be deposited with the title company immediately upon that, them waiving the contingency. And the next one we have is the addendum for backup contract. We're seeing more and more of this now that we have some shortage in inventory. So A backup contract is negotiated, executed, option money, earnest money, everything is done just like a regular contract. And the date of the contract that is in the first position goes in paragraph A. So the first contract goes in paragraph A of the backup addendum when it's supposed to close. And neither party is required to perform under the backup contract while it's still contingent upon the termination of the first contract. Now, if the first contract does terminate, the date in paragraph B of the backup addendum, then the backup contract terminates and the earnest money is refunded to the buyer. If the first contract terminates on or before the date specified in paragraph B, then the seller has to notify the buyer immediately. The date that, now this is important, the date that the seller notifies the buyer of the termination of the first contract, that becomes the amended effective date of the backup contract. And all the time-sensitive portions of the contract are based on this amended effective date. So, again, if the amended effective date is today, let's say that the backup contract went into effect on October 1st. And the contract was supposed to have closed on November 1st. But it didn't. It fell through. So they've notified them that now you're in primary position, and our new effective date is November 1st, and all counting starts from there. So November 1st being day 0, and then November 2nd being day 1, and so on, like for the option period. Okay, the next one, this isn't used a lot. It's the environmental assessment addendum. And there's a number of days that the buyer has to get certain reports in, has to do with environmental assessments, endangered species, wetlands, and things like that. Just need to pay attention to those dates if you happen to use this addendum. Short sale addendum. This is a lot like the backup addendum. It has an amended effective date. If the seller's in a short sale situation, the short sale addendum must be attached to the contract, and in paragraph D of the short sale addendum, the buyer and the seller agree that on or before a specified date, the seller is going to have the lien holder's consent to sell the property. If they don't have that by the specified date, then the contract terminates. But if the seller does get the consent, they notify the buyer immediately, and then the date the seller notifies the buyer of the lien holder's consent, this becomes the amended effective date of the contract. And all time-sensitive portions of the contract will move forward from there. Again, if they were to get that today, on November 1st, then that is going to be the new effective date of the contract. The lead-based paint addendum, there are a couple of time-sensitive things in here. Of course, it always needs to be attached to any contract on a house that was constructed before 1978. If the buyer does want to get a lead-based paint assessment, they have 10 days to have it inspected, and then they have 14 days from the execution date to terminate if there's problems with lead-based paint and they want to terminate the contract. Then we have other. This is where we put any other addendum that might be connected with the contract. One that a lot of people use is second consent to intermediary and things like that. But the two that are very important as far as time sensitivity go are a relocation or a foreclosure addendum. And these need to be carefully reviewed. In most cases, these addenda supersede anything else that's in the contract. Some of the lending institutions and relocation companies base the effective date of the contract on a verbal acceptance. So since this is such a crucial part of the contract, be sure that there's an understanding as to what they are considering the effective date, because you may have verbal agreement and the clock may be starting to tick, and it may be 2 or 3 days before they actually get that executed contract back to you. So be very aware of that. And another thing that may be connected with the contract is the amendment. Usually we have at least a repair amendment that's connected with the contract, and sometimes there's many others. This is what you have to use if you're going to make changes. Once the contract has been executed, you cannot make any kind of changes to the contract after that. Everything must be done through an amendment. And a couple of other forms that I want to mention is the notice of buyer's termination of contract. This is used to notify the seller that the buyer is going to terminate the contract for the reason checked on the form. There's a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons is that they're opting out during the option period. Your timelines need to be closely monitored so the form is delivered according to the contract guidelines. If someone's opting out and they have a 10-day option period, you need to make sure that you get this to the other agent within that 10-day period. Okay. Next we have our release of earnest money. This is usually in conjunction with the delivery of the termination. And the release of earnest money may be disputed back and forth, but make sure that you do get that adheres to the guidelines, that you respond within the 7 days that you have to respond. Okay, that is, in a nutshell, the most time-sensitive portions of the contract. And again, there's different levels of the number of transactions that you have done, and many of you are familiar with these different time frames, and some of you are not. So hopefully we brought a few more things to light that will be helpful. Now this next portion is a contract to close timeline. Our buyers and our sellers, they know what we're doing prior to going under contract. With the buyers, you're taking them around, you're showing them houses, they see you all the time. With the seller, you're marketing their home, you're talking to them, you're negotiating the contract, so you're very involved with them. Then when we get to from contract to close, they don't see you quite as much. And I think this timeline is very beneficial to give to the buyer and the seller to look at, so they see all those things that are going on, usually in that very short time frame of about 30 to 45 days. So these are all the things that are going on behind the scenes, and they can see what you're doing. And we're going to go through these quickly, and then we're going to actually do a worksheet where we talk about each step of this that you're going to do, and we'll fill that out together. So first, we've got the buyer and the seller have the contractual agreement, the option money is delivered, then the earnest money is delivered, so all that happens right away. The next thing that I might like to make a note of, be sure you tell your buyer that that earnest money check is going to be cashed and deposited into a trust account, that it's not just being held by the title company. If their option period begins, you want to order the property inspections in a timely fashion. And while all this is going on, the title company is opening their files, they're beginning the title search, issuing commitments and things like that. Okay, you're going to need to pay close attention to the expiration of the option period. Make sure that you get those repair requests to the seller's agent, the listing agent, and the seller's able to look through those and get a response back to you. You want to start thinking about homeowners insurance, property appraisal, make sure that that's done in a timely fashion, and the lender is going to be preparing the loan package and submitting it for final underwriting approval. Loan approvals granted. There might be some lender required conditions to be met by the buyer that you as the buyer's agent would need to make sure that they stay on top of that. The survey may need to be ordered by the title company. Buyer and seller agents need to coordinate the closing date and time with the title company, and also the transfer of utilities. I think this is forgotten a lot, and nothing worse than a buyer moving into a house and has no electricity or water. Okay, next we've got the lender's closing instructions go to the title company, the HUD one. The buyer, we need to let our buyer know they have to have a cashier's check or wire transfer for their closing costs or any portion of the down payment. And then we always want to have the buyer do a final walkthrough and let the seller know that they're going to be doing that. Okay, the title company closes the sale. They receive funds from the lender, and basically we're closed and funded at this point. All fees, everything has to be collected before funding. Then we have possession, and it's granted to the buyer according to the terms of the contract. The title company prepares and issues the title policy and sends it to the buyer, and then the title company records the legal documents, and those are all sent to the buyer from the county clerk's office. So again, this is a lot of information. This is a lot to happen in a very, very short period of time. And again, I think it's very beneficial to let the buyer and the seller understand what you're doing behind the scenes during the time from contract to close. Now I'd like for you to go ahead and get it's entitled Contract to Close Checklist, and you have one for the buyer and one for the seller. And I want to walk you through what you would do with this. And this is what's going to keep you on track. This you may want to do this electronically, you may want to do it on paper, whatever works for you. But if you're trying to juggle a lot of transactions, this is very, very helpful to make sure that you stay on track. So let's go ahead and get out that checklist, and all your information will be right here on the checklist. So first you put the property address, buyer's name, seller name, listing agent and their contact information, title company and their contact information, and then let's start with the effective date of the contract. Okay, effective date of the contract, let's say, is today, so that would be 11/1, and we're going to close it on 11/30, so put those dates in there. Let's say we have a 10-day option period, so write 10 in there. Financing days are 20, and then the HOA documents will be received within 10 days. Now let's go down this list. What I like to do is the date to be performed at the very beginning of the contract. Go ahead and fill in date to be performed dates. Now you may have to change some of them and adjust them, but if you'll fill these in advance, then you've got a reference point. You have something to check back to. Every day you can make sure you're on track. So on day one, all these are going to be from making sure the execution date's on the contract, setting up the transaction file, and again, you can do that electronically, on paper, or both, whatever works for you. Put your executed contract in the file along with the lender's letter, proof of funds, seller's disclosure, all that information. Do that on day one. Then you want to email that executed contract to the listing agent, title company, and lender. Make sure everybody has a copy. Even if you're going to be delivering it later in person, it's good to go ahead and get that to them so they're aware that it's coming. You deliver the option money to the seller or the seller's representative. Remember, don't just stick it in the mail or don't just drop it at the title company. Be sure you get that receipted within 2 days. So again, try to do that on the first day. Let's say, for example, on this option money, we put that we were going to do this on the 1st, but we didn't actually get it there till the 2nd. So put 11/2 in the box for date completed. All these other things probably have 11/1 in date completed. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm missing I've skipped something here. Let me get us on the right spot. There we go. I apologize. I'm behind on my slides, but hopefully you're following along on your paper. So anyway, there was the top portion, and then here's where we are now. Okay, with the option money, let's say that you were going to do that on the 1st, but you didn't get it done till the 2nd. So date completed, just put 11/2 in there. Deliver the earnest money to the title company. Let's say you were going to do that on 11/1. You got tied up, so you had them send a courier to pick that up. So you would put your date completed as 11/1 on there. Now, once you have all these delivered and get the receipted page, you want to make sure you insert that receipted page in your contract. This makes you have a complete file. Good record keeping is very important for you as an agent. So if you follow this checklist, you're going to have all your forms in order in your file like they need to be. And it's going to show that you did follow this transaction from beginning to end and you didn't leave anything out. The next portion of this, you'd want to turn the contract into your broker if that's required at your office, and they may need to send the commission disbursement out to the title company. All these things, again, should be handled in the first couple of days. You want to get that property inspection scheduled. So let's say you get the property inspection scheduled on November 2nd, but over on date completed, that would be the date the actual inspection happens. Let's say it doesn't actually happen until the 4th, so that would be your date of inspection. Next, I have on here, get a clue report from an insurance agent. This is something that I found is very helpful to do right off the bat. You don't even have to go with that agent if you don't want to, but make sure that you get an insurance agent to run a clue report even before you do the home inspection. This way, you're going to know if there's been a lot of claims against the property. The insurance rate for the house may be outrageous, and you're not going to know that if you don't have this clue report in advance. So I always recommend doing that before the home buyer spends any money on inspections even. Okay, you want to coordinate the expiration of the option period and any proposed repairs and amendments. The date I put in here for date to be performed, I put the date that the option ends. Now you're going to probably do this prior to that, but it's important that you keep that date in front of you. So we go back to our effective date of the contract, and then we say, okay, that's 11/1. We have a 10-day option. So all this needs to be done by the 11th of November. So put that date in there and have that to refer back to. You want to follow up on the delivery of the HOA documents. that's going to be, let's see, we have 10 days in there. So again, by the 11th, that needs to be done. And the next thing is you want to notify the lender of the end of the option period. So the end of the option period is on the 11th. You may come to an agreement on repairs even sooner than that. So put the date of the 11th in there, but as soon as that has ended, you want to notify that lender so they can schedule the appraisal. They're not going to schedule the appraisal prior to the option period being ended because they don't want the buyer to have to pay for an appraisal if they're going to opt out. Then you want to follow up and see when the appraisal is scheduled. So let's say we've contacted them on the 11th and told them that it was the end of the option period. Then on the 13th, we follow up to make sure it's been scheduled if they haven't told us. And then we want to find out, once the appraisal's done, we want to find out if there's any lender required repairs, because we need to get those over to the listing agent as well. And then we want to confirm that the property has made value, that it appraised for the purchase price. So all these things, you need to fill in dates. What I put there was like 11/15, and that's just a guess as to when the appraisal is going to be done, but it's a reference point for me to go back to. On that date, I'll check it, I'll see if everything's finished. If it's not, and they say, oh, this is going to be done on the 17th, then I change my date to the 17th in that box. Okay, let's go to the second page of the buyer one. It says, coordinate the expiration date of the financing period. Well, again, remember we have a 20-day financing period, so it expires on the 21st of November. About the 19th, you're going to want to check with that lender and say, hey, you know, is everything in order? Are we good to go? It's important that you have that information. If you go past that and then they don't get financing, they may not get their earnest money back, and this would be very important to that buyer. Okay, you want to follow up on the delivery of the title commitment. Again, how many days does the contract say? It says they have 20 days to get the commitment to them. And more than likely you have received it by then, but on the 21st of November, you'd want to make sure that they have that title commitment. Follow up with the lender to see where the loan is in the underwriting process. I would do that on the 21st also. By then, the appraisal should be in, everything should be ready to go. Verify that the buyer has met the lender's required conditions. You don't necessarily know what those conditions are, but you may want to check with the lender and say, hey, were there any conditions? So you can follow up with your buyer and make sure that they have gotten the documents requested or whatever to the lender in a timely fashion. If a survey needs to be ordered, you need to make sure that that's been ordered within the time frame. I would usually check up on that about a week before closing as well. The 23rd is what I would put in here for coordinate transfer of utilities. Again, this is a week before. Remind your buyer, hey, you may want to check with your electric company, gas, water, whatever, and set up a date for those utilities to be turned on. We want to verify that the title company's received their closing documents and is preparing the HUD. Many times this doesn't happen until right up on closing, but really we should see if that's going, about 3 days before closing, we want to check in with them. So if we're supposed to close on the 30th, let's check in with them on the 27th and see where they're at. Let's say that they did have everything prepared on the 27th. Then on the 28th, we would want to review that HUD with the buyer. We would want to tell them how much they need to bring to closing, what they need to have in a cashier's check. And then make sure your buyer obtains a cashier's check or wire transfer, and that tell them it needs to be made out to the title company. Again, on about the 28th, 29th is when you would do that. And I filled all these dates in right when I first started the transaction. I put my timeline in here and I filled in these dates. Again, they may change, but it gives me a point of reference. Remind your buyer to bring a photo ID to closing. Okay, then we want to do the final walkthrough on the 30th, on the day of closing, or maybe the night before, but you want to do a final walkthrough. And prior to that, you may have done a walkthrough to check on the items that were to be repaired, but I always like to just, the morning of closing, do one quick final walkthrough just to make sure the house is still there, basically. And I put on my schedule to take a photo of the house at this time. You may or may not do this, but I send out just sold cards, and I keep a picture of the house in my client's files. So that's a good time to do that as well. You want to coordinate with the listing agent the transfer of keys. Do they want you to take the key out of the lockbox and then they're going to leave the rest of the keys in the house? Are you going to have the keys at the title company for the buyer to pick up? You need to find out how they want to do that. Then of course you'll go to closing, sign the documents, and you want to deliver the keys to the buyer after you've been notified that the transaction is actually funded. Want to find out when the buyer is going to be moving, and I always like to schedule a time to drop by just to make sure once they got in the house that everything was okay. And I'd like to drop off a closing gift. If you want to put a date in there, let's say you're closing on the 30th, you want to come back by the 2nd, drop off a closing gift. And then I put in here also a time to follow up with the buyer about after they've been in the house a week or so. I'll try to follow up phone call or drop by just to make sure everything's going okay. And we're getting a little bit close on time, so I'm going to go through the things on the seller's checklist that are maybe just a little bit different than what's on the buyer's checklist. So if you pull that one out, it says contract to close checklist, seller, and at the top you're going to have the property address, seller name, buyer's agent's title company, contact information, and all that. The effective date's going to be the same. It'll be 11/1, closing date of 11/30, still have a 10-day option, 20-day financing, and 10 days to get the HOA information. Now, if you go through here, the first part of this you're going to realize is basically the same, except when you get down to, let's see here, we're going to change the status in MLS and CSS. When you go under contract, per MLS rules, you need to get that status changed pretty quickly. So make sure you do that. I think that's one of the things that a lot of people forget. You'll go out to look at a house, you've scheduled it through CSS, and you get out there and the inspection's being done. So that's not a good thing. So if you have it on your list, you'll make sure that you're going to do it. And then as you go down the list a little bit, everything is basically the same. You do want to let the seller know what to expect when the inspector comes in the house, how long they're going to be there, and that sort of thing. And then if you look a little further down the list, it has changed status in CSS and MLS again. Well, this is once we've coordinated all the repairs and we've agreed on everything, then we need to change that status again to a pending status. Make sure you do that one. And with the buyer, they were checking on the delivery of the HOA docs right about the time they were to be delivered. With the seller, I would be checking on those about 5 days in. With a 10-day HOA delivery date, about 5 days in, be sure that they have been ordered and that they're going to be there on time. If they can't be there on time for some reason, then you can do an amendment and say, hey, I've checked with them, they're going to be 14 days instead. Do that amendment to cover your seller. And at the bottom of this first page, I have meet the appraiser at the house for the appraisal. This is something that you may or may not do, but you do want to be aware of when the appraisal is going on. Make sure your seller knows to have the house looking good, that sort of thing. We go to the next page. Basically everything remains the same. The seller is going to be checking with the seller's agent, the listing agent is going to be checking with the buyer's agent as to the progress of the loan. And then when we get down towards the bottom, you're going to want to make sure that your seller is notified that there's going to be a final walkthrough on the property. You want to make sure that you have all the keys, garage door openers, things like that from the seller. And you want to notify the seller when we fund, of course. And then the next thing, nothing more embarrassing than have a seller to call the real estate office and say, hey, I've been in this, or the buyer call and say, I've been in this house for 2 weeks, are y'all ever going to come get your sign? Mm-hmm. So put that on your list of things to do. A lot happens at the very end, so make sure that you're going to go get your sign and your lockbox. And hopefully you're selling that seller another home, so you're going to be in contact with them. But you may want to just keep on your list that you're going to follow up with the seller as well. Now we have about 5 minutes left for questions, so let me see, does anybody have any questions?
There's a couple here, Roxie.
Okay, let me see. First one says, paragraph 7F states that repairs and treatments are to be performed by licensed, otherwise authorized by law. Does this include seller wanting to perform his or her own repairs? It actually does need to be performed by a licensed contractor per the contract. Now, the seller and the buyer can come to some sort of an agreement on an amendment if there are some things that seller wants to do themselves and the buyer agrees to it. That's fine, but per the contract, it does need to be done by a licensed person. Okay, let's see. The next one says, do you use the list on paper only and manually place in your calendar? let's see, or is there some electronic program that sends you reminders? I actually do everything electronically. I put it in, I have Google Mail, and it's in my Google Mail system, and I have alerts and things in there, but and I have it on my iPad all the time. So I choose to do. About a year ago, I went electronic with everything, but you know, paper is good too, just so you have some sort of a checklist, and then some people like to have both. And let's see.
Yeah.
Can you show the questions or read in its entirety? Okay, I think I did read them in their entirety, kind of the way they came in, and I don't believe we don't have a way to show them, do we?
No, there's no way, but I think she's just wanting you to repeat that question.
Repeat? Okay, it says, do you use the list on paper only and manually place in your calendar, or is there some electronic program or internet program that will send you reminders for each of these action items? You can no, there's really not a program that I'm aware of that will send it to you. Now, you can put it in your calendar with alerts every time you put a transaction in there, but you would have to manually put that in, as far as I know. Okay, let's see. I believe, okay, it says there are contract to close programs. Have you tried any of them? No, I have not tried any of the contract to close programs. If you have any recommendations, you might want to go ahead and type that in there if anybody knows of any that are really good. It says, with an accepted backup contract, does the listing agent hold the earnest money and option money check until such time that the backup contract becomes the primary contract? No, they don't. The option money needs to go to the seller, and the earnest money needs to go to the title company, just like with a regular contract. And actually, the option money does not have to be refunded, even if it does not turn into a primary contract. Okay, let's see. Someone else is asking about buyer gift limits. $50 is what has always been stated, and I believe that is still true.